Michael's voice cracked on the high note, splitting the air like glass, and in that instant, everyone in Studio A froze, Joseph's hand closing into a fist so tight his knuckles went white. Wait, because what happened in the next 30 seconds wasn't just a recording mishap. It was the moment Michael realized his childhood voice, the one that had made him famous, was dying, and the choice he made while everyone stared would determine whether he became a solo legend or faded into history as just another child star who couldn't survive puberty. The playback had been perfect up to bar 16. Michael stood at the RCA 44 ribbon microphone, headphones pressing against his afro, watching the tape reels spin behind the glass. The studio smelled like coffee gone cold and magnetic tape running hot. His brothers were in the corner of the booth, Jermaine tuning his bass, Marlon tapping a rhythm on his thigh, Tito checking his guitar strap. They'd been at this for 6 hours. The new album needed 10 tracks. They had 3. Joseph sat in the producer's chair on the other side of the glass, arms crossed, one leg bouncing. The studio photographer had been circling them all morning, catching angles, building the archive. Just another session, just another song. Look, because if you'd been watching from outside, through that small window in the studio door, you would have seen what looked like routine. A boy at a microphone, his father watching, brothers waiting. But routines have a way of ending exactly when you stop expecting them to. Michael closed his eyes and started the verse again. Everything felt right until the bridge. The note was an E above middle C, not particularly high, something he'd hit 1,000 times before. But this time, halfway through the hold, his voice split. Not a crack like a mistake, a crack like breaking. The sound that came out was half boy, half something else, wavering between registers like a radio stuck between stations. For a fraction of a second, it almost sounded like 2 people singing at once, the high, pure tone he'd been famous for since age 6 colliding with something lower, rougher, uncontrolled. The engineer's hand shot to the talkback button, but stopped halfway, frozen in that awful space between reacting and pretending nothing had happened. Joseph stood up slowly from his chair, the movement deliberate, controlled, which was always worse than when he moved fast. Tito's hand went still on the guitar neck, fingers pressed against strings that suddenly seemed to need all his attention. In the control room, 3 people held their breath at exactly the same moment, and the silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it, that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Michael kept his eyes closed, but his throat had locked. He could feel the heat rising in his face, starting somewhere in his chest and climbing like a tide. The microphone suddenly too close, the headphones too tight, pressing against his skull. Sweat beaded at his hairline. His fingers found the mic stand and gripped, and he could feel the metal cold and solid under his palm, the only real thing in a room that had suddenly gone strange and distant. His brothers shifted in the corner. Nobody spoke. The tape kept rolling. Somewhere outside Studio A, footsteps passed in the hallway, someone laughing about something that had nothing to do with this room, this moment, this disaster. Notice how silence can be louder than sound. In that control room, with 3 men holding their breath and a 14-year-old boy gripping a microphone stand, like it was the only thing keeping him from falling, what wasn't being said was louder than any note Michael could have sung, and what Joseph was calculating in that silence would echo for decades. Listen, because this is where most people get it wrong. They think the crisis was about hitting the note. It wasn't. Michael had already understood what was happening to his body for months. The voice drops that came and went. The unpredictable moments when a phrase would land in a register he didn't recognize. What terrified him in that studio wasn't puberty. It was Joseph's silence. Through the glass, he could see his father's face. Not angry yet. Worse, calculating. The expression Michael had learned to read when he was 6 years old. The one that meant Joseph was running numbers in his head, assessing damage, planning next moves. His father's eyes weren't even on him. They were on the tape machine, on the clock above the console, on Rick the engineer, everywhere except where they should be. The photographer lowered his camera slowly. Even he knew not to capture this. Carl had shot hundreds of sessions at Motown, but this was different. This was watching someone's childhood end in real time. "Stop the tape," Joseph said. His voice came through the overhead speaker, flat and cold and perfectly controlled. The reel stopped spinning with a mechanical sigh. The sudden silence in Michael's headphones felt like falling, like the floor dropping out, like the moment in a dream when you realize you're about to hit the ground. His ears rang in the absence of music, that high-pitched whine that means you've been listening too loud for too long. He pulled them off, letting them hang around his neck, and looked at the control room. Joseph was standing now, both hands on the console, leaning forward. The engineer was staring at the VU meters. "We're taking 5, Joseph said. Michael's brothers didn't move. Nobody moved. "Michael," Joseph said, "come here." The walk from the vocal booth to the control room was 12 feet. It took forever. "Wait. Before we follow Michael through that door, you need to understand something about studios. They're designed to capture sound, but what they really capture is truth. Every hesitation, every breath, every moment when someone realizes their life is about to change. That's what the machines are recording, even when the tape isn't rolling." Michael's legs felt disconnected from his body, moving on their own, carrying him toward the door, through the hallway where the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, into the control room where Joseph waited. The control room was smaller than the booth, crammed with equipment that blinked and hummed. Rick stood up and left without being asked, gathering his coffee mug and notepad. The door clicked shut behind him. Joseph didn't sit down. He stood with his back to the console, looking at Michael like he was a malfunctioning piece of equipment. For 10 seconds, he said nothing, just looked. And in those 10 seconds, Michael felt himself shrinking, getting smaller, younger. "Then how long has this been happening?" Michael's mouth opened. Nothing came out at first. His vocal cords, the same ones that had just betrayed him in front of everyone, now refused to work for even basic speech. The irony wasn't lost on him. Then quietly, "A few weeks, sometimes, not every time." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was hoping it would go away. Because I'm 14 and I don't know how to tell my father that my body is doing something I can't control. Because if I said it out loud, it would make it real." "I thought it would stop," he said instead. Joseph's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped beneath the skin. He turned away, looking through the glass at the empty vocal booth, at the microphone still standing there like a witness to what had just happened, at the tape machine with its reels frozen mid-song, at the space where his son had just discovered that childhood doesn't ask permission before it ends. For a moment, Michael thought he saw something in his father's face. Not anger, not disappointment. Something closer to recognition, maybe, like Joseph was remembering his own moment of understanding that the world doesn't care about what you want to be, only what it needs you to be. But the moment passed. "You know what this means," Joseph said. Not looking at him, Michael did know. He'd known since the first time it happened. Alone in his bedroom, singing along to a Smokey Robinson record, the Jackson 5 worked because of the blend. Jermaine's smoothness, Michael's high clarity, the way their voices locked together in harmonies that sounded impossibly tight. But that sound required Michael's voice to stay exactly where it was. A boy soprano, pure, untouched. If his voice dropped, the blend broke. And if the blend broke, what was the Jackson 5? "We can work around it," Michael said. The words came out smaller than he meant them to. "I can control it. I just need to control it." Joseph turned back to face him. "You think you can control puberty? Remember this, because what Joseph said next is something Michael never told anyone. Not in interviews, not in his autobiography, not even years later when he tried to explain where his perfectionism came from. but 3 people heard it. Rick, standing outside the door with his ear pressed to the gap, the photographer, who'd quietly returned to the hallway, and Jermaine, who'd left the vocal booth and was standing just out of sight around the corner. "You were special because you were a child," Joseph said. His voice was quiet now, which made it worse than yelling. America doesn't care about teenage boys. They care about the cute kid with the high voice, the one who's different. Once you sound like everyone else, you're done. Michael felt something crack inside his chest that had nothing to do with his voice. "So what do I do?" he asked. Joseph looked at him for a long moment. Then he sat down in the producer's chair, leaning back, hands behind his head. "You have 2 choices," he finally said. "Either you figure out how to keep that voice exactly where it is, which we both know isn't possible, or you become something else. Something bigger than the group." Bigger than Michael stopped. "You mean solo? I mean, you need to be so good that it doesn't matter what you sound like. You need to be undeniable. Not cute, not special because you're young. Undeniable because you're better than everyone." The words hung in the air. Notice what's happening here. This isn't a father encouraging his son. This is a businessman explaining market reality to a failing asset. But Michael, at 14, heard something else. He heard, "You can still matter. There's still a way forward. You just have to be perfect." That's when it started. Not the perfectionism about performance. He'd had that since he was 6. This was different. This was perfectionism about survival. The understanding that every choice, every note, every move from now on had to justify his existence in an industry that was about to stop caring about him. Joseph stood up. "Get back in the booth. We're doing it again. What if it happens again? Then we keep going until it doesn't." Michael walked back into Studio A. His brothers looked at him but didn't ask. The engineer returned to his chair, reset the tape, queued up the track. The photographer raised his camera. Michael put the headphones back on and stepped up to the microphone. But this time, something was different. Stop for a second and picture this from above, because what you're about to see only makes sense when you understand what Michael was looking at. The vocal booth, with its padded walls, the microphone, tall and silver, through the glass, Joseph in the producer's chair, arms crossed again, Rick at the console, one hand hovering over the record button, and Michael, 14 years old, standing alone under the studio lights, about to sing the same line that had just betrayed him. He closed his eyes, took a breath, started the verse. This time, when he reached the bridge, something happened that Rick would later call the strangest thing I ever heard in 30 years of recording. Michael hit the note, but he didn't try to force his voice to stay high, didn't fight against the natural break that was happening in his throat. Instead, he let it crack deliberately, right at the peak, and then in the split second between registers, in that microsecond of vulnerability, he flipped into a completely different technique. A rasp, a catch in the throat that sounded almost like pain, almost like he was holding back tears, that turned the break into an ornament, a feature, a moment of raw emotion. It shouldn't have worked. By every technical standard taught in every voice lesson Michael had ever taken, it was wrong. You don't lean into the crack. You don't highlight the weakness. You smooth it over. You cover it. You pretend it isn't happening. That's what professionals do. But it sounded heartbreaking. Rick's hands stopped over the console, hovering above a fader he'd been about to move. Joseph leaned forward in the producer's chair until his chest touched the edge of the desk. Even Tito looked up from his guitar, fingers gone still on the frets, and Marlon stopped his unconscious tapping, and Jermaine's mouth opened slightly like he was about to say something but couldn't find words. Michael kept singing, and now he was using the cracks, making them part of the performance, turning his breaking voice into an instrument instead of a liability. Every time his voice threatened to slip, he pushed it further, made it slip harder, controlled the loss of control in a way that sounded paradoxically more powerful than perfection. The vulnerability in it, the way it sounded like he was barely holding on, like something in him was breaking in real time, made the lyric, some throwaway line about teenage love that had been written in 20 minutes and revised once, suddenly feel real, urgent, true. When he finished, the playback kept rolling. Nobody stopped it. Through the headphones, Michael heard his own voice coming back at him, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't hate what he heard. It wasn't the pure boy soprano that had made him famous, but it was something else, something that sounded like it cost him something to sing. Remember, this is the moment when everything shifts, not because Michael learned a new technique, but because he learned that the parts of yourself you try to hide are often the parts that make people feel something. And once you learn that lesson, you can never unlearn it. Joseph's voice came through the speaker. Again, same thing. They did 6 more takes. Each time, Michael used the breaks, the cracks, the moments where his voice betrayed him and turned them into texture. By take 7, Rick was nodding, moving faders, building the mix in real time. By take 9, Jermaine was watching his little brother like he was seeing someone he didn't quite recognize. Carl, the photographer, who'd lowered his camera during the disaster, raised it again now, but he wasn't shooting Michael anymore. He was shooting the space between Michael and Joseph, the glass, the distance. Years later, he'd say that's when he knew the Jackson 5's days were numbered. Not because Michael's voice had changed, because the way Joseph looked at Michael had changed. He was watching an investment mature, a product evolve, not a son growing up. The session ran until midnight. When they finally stopped, Joseph didn't say good job or that worked. He just said, tomorrow we do 3 more tracks, and you sing every lead. Notice what just happened. Those 7 words were a verdict and a sentence. Lead vocals meant visibility, meant responsibility, meant if the song failed, everyone would know whose fault it was. But it also meant Joseph believed Michael could carry it, or needed him to. Michael walked out of MOTOWN Studio A at 12:47 a.m., with his brothers trailing behind him, too tired to talk. The building felt different at night, hollow, sacred. But he wasn't thinking about the session anymore. He was thinking about what Joseph had said, bigger than the group, undeniable, perfect. The photographer got one last shot. Michael's face, looking back over his shoulder at the studio door. The expression isn't quite a smile. Determination mixed with fear. He was 14 years old. His voice had cracked, and in the 30 seconds after it happened, he'd made a choice. Not to fight the change, to use it, to turn every weakness, every break, every vulnerable moment into something the audience couldn't look away from. Within 2 years, he'd have his first solo #1. Within 6, he'd leave the Jackson 5. Within 12, he'd release Thriller and become the biggest star on the planet. But it all traced back to this night, this decision to weaponize his imperfections. Here's what nobody talks about, though. The cost. Listen one more time, because this is where the story gets complicated. Success always looks simple from the outside. A voice cracks, a boy adapts, a star is born. But inside that process, inside the mind of someone learning to turn their pain into product, something else is happening. Something that doesn't have a happy ending. Because once Michael understood that vulnerability sold, that the cracks in his voice made people feel something, he started applying that logic to everything. His dancing make it look like you're barely in control, like you might fall at any second. His interviews show them just enough pain to make them care. His entire public persona build it around the idea that you're fragile, that you're breaking, that you need protection. And once you train yourself to perform vulnerability, where does the performance end and the real vulnerability begin? Michael spent the next 30 years trying to figure that out. He never did. The tape from that session still exists, somewhere in the Motown archives. On it, you can hear the exact moment the boy soprano died and something else was born. The voice that would sing Billie Jean. The voice that would whisper he into a billion ears. The voice that would crack, deliberately now on the word bad, turning it into a threat. It all started the night his voice broke, and he decided to break it harder. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. If you want to hear what happened 6 months later, when Motown executives tried to replace him with a younger singer who still had his high range, tell me in the comments.